The town of San Diego was in chaos. After the uprising, which left several men dead and injured, the town hall became a grim fortress. Guards paced outside, and children, curious about the noise and commotion, gathered at the door, trying to peek inside. The town's once bustling center had turned into a scene of fear and tension. Inside, the mood was just as dark. Civil guards and cuadrilleros, native police, were stationed at every corner. The only sound was the quiet rustling of papers by the director Silio and the occasional barked order from the alférez, the military officer in charge. Doña Consolación, the alférez's wife, sat in a corner, watching everything with cruel interest. Known for her rough manners and vicious tendencies, she had convinced her husband to let her observe the interrogations. Her eyes were cold and calculating, eager for the torment to come. She had a reputation for brutality, having once whipped a servant nearly to death for a minor mistake. Across the room, the seat beneath the portrait of the King of Spain remained empty, reserved for the town's Gobernador Silio. He, however, seemed too fearful to attend. His absence made the room feel even more oppressive. The tension heightened as the town's curate, Padre Salvi, entered the room. He was pale, his usually calm face etched with anxiety. He had been deeply involved in the political life of the town and knew that today's events would have long-lasting consequences. He moved to take the chair under the king's portrait, a subtle acknowledgement of his authority in town matters, even though he wished to be elsewhere. "Well, Padre, I see you couldn't keep yourself away," sneered the alférez, his tone mocking. "I would rather not be here, but duty calls," Padre Salvi replied in a low voice, ignoring the alférez's hostility. He was clearly uncomfortable, but as the spiritual leader, he had to maintain a presence. "They're leaving this afternoon," the alférez continued. "Ibarra and the teniente mayor, both arrested." Padre Salvi nodded, though he looked distracted. He knew the political storm brewing around Crisostomo Ibarra, the town's progressive reformer, who had recently been implicated in the failed uprising. Whether guilty or not, Ibarra's fate seemed sealed. The alférez gave a signal, and 2 guards opened the door to the jail cells. A putrid stench filled the room, causing even the hardened soldiers to recoil. Out of the darkness stumbled 2 figures, Tarsilo Alasagan, a young man with a strong build but now disheveled, and another prisoner limping and weeping from injuries. Tarsilo's wrists were bound with bloodied handcuffs, his clothing torn and dirty. Despite his pitiful state, there was a fierce defiance in his eyes. "This one fought back the hardest," the alférez said to Padre Salvi, pointing to Tarsilo. "He told his comrades to flee while he stayed behind." Tarsilo, though beaten and broken, looked around the room with contempt. His eyes briefly rested on Doña Consolación, and he curled his lips in a sneer. His hatred for these people, those responsible for his suffering, was palpable. The second prisoner was trembling, blood dripping down his leg. "Mercy, sir! I can't go back to the yard. Please, have mercy!" he whimpered, his voice shaking. "Coward," muttered the alférez, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. He turned back to Tarsilo. "What did Crisostomo Ibarra promise you for attacking the barracks?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Tarsilo remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Don Crisostomo had nothing to do with it," he said, his voice low but steady. "You killed my father with your beatings. We were only avenging him." There was a stunned silence in the room. Tarsilo's words cut through the tension like a knife. The alférez blinked in surprise, not expecting such a bold response. He glanced at Padre Salvi, who looked away, avoiding the alférez's eyes. "You dare lie to me?" the alférez shouted, his face flushing with anger. "Who were your accomplices? Tell me, or you will suffer." Tarsilo smirked bitterly. "I have nothing more to say. My brother Bruno is dead, and soon I will join him. Do what you will." The alférez clenched his fist, enraged by Tarsilo's defiance. He raised a rattan whip poised to strike. "You will talk," he hissed through gritted teeth. Tarsilo didn't flinch. He stared at the alférez with a look of disdain, and the room went silent as the whip cracked across his back. His muscles tensed, but he refused to cry out. Blow after blow, Tarsilo endured the punishment without a word. The alférez, growing frustrated, turned to the soldiers. "Take him outside, show him the bodies of his comrades. Maybe that will loosen his tongue." 2 soldiers grabbed Tarsilo and dragged him into the courtyard. On a cart lay 5 corpses, half covered by a filthy mat. One of the bodies was his brother Bruno, riddled with bayonet wounds. Another was Lucas, the man who had been hanged earlier. The sight of his brother's lifeless body caused Tarsilo's hardened expression to falter. A quiet sigh escaped him, though he remained silent. "Well?" the alférez demanded. "Do you know them?" Tarsilo remained quiet, his eyes fixed on Bruno's lifeless form. The alférez, growing impatient, whipped him again. "Speak, or I'll make you suffer worse than this." Tarsilo's lips tightened, but he still refused to answer. Infuriated, the alférez ordered the soldiers to tie him to a wooden bench. His hands, still in shackles, were bound tightly, and he was forced to lie down. As the soldiers prepared the instruments of torture, Doña Consolación moved closer, her eyes glinting with anticipation. "Ah, so this is the hero," she muttered under her breath, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Tarsilo looked up at her, his face twisted in disgust. "I've never seen an uglier woman in my life," he spat. "I'd rather die here on this bench than spend a single night with you as your husband does." The room fell into a shocked silence. Even the soldiers stopped what they were doing, exchanging uneasy glances. Doña Consolación's face turned ashen. Trembling with rage, she ordered, "Gag him! Make him pay for those words!" A rag was forced into Tarsilo's mouth, but the satisfaction in his eyes showed that he had achieved his goal. His defiance had wounded her pride. At a signal from the alférez, the torture began. The soldiers whipped Tarsilo's back, his body convulsing with each blow. His muffled cries were barely audible, but his eyes remained locked on Doña Consolación, filled with loathing. As the torture continued, Padre Salvi, who had been watching from the side, could take no more. He rose from his seat, his face pale and drawn, and quietly left the room. Outside, he encountered Tarsilo's sister, who stood rigid against the wall, listening to the sounds of her brother's suffering. Her eyes were wide with horror, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She didn't move or speak, but her presence added to the weight of Padre Salvi's guilt. He lowered his head and hurried away. Back inside the hall, Tarsilo's punishment showed no sign of stopping. The soldiers, their arms tired from the repeated beatings, finally let him go, his body slumped in exhaustion. Doña Consolación, still fuming, whispered something to her husband. The alférez nodded grimly. "To the well with him," he ordered. The soldiers untied Tarsilo and dragged him to the well in the courtyard. The well was old and filthy, its water thick and foul-smelling. Prisoners who were lowered into it rarely survived, succumbing to sickness or drowning in its depths. Tarsilo's face, pale and bloodied, showed no fear as he was tied to the bamboo sweep, ready to be lowered headfirst into the dark water. "Do it slowly," Doña Consolación ordered, her voice laced with malice. "Let him feel it." The bamboo creaked as Tarsilo was slowly lowered into the well. His body brushed against the jagged rocks, cutting his skin as he descended into the darkness. When he was finally submerged, the alférez counted the seconds, watching the surface of the water intently. After 30 seconds, he gave the order to pull Tarsilo up. When Tarsilo emerged, his face was bruised and bloody, his body shaking from the cold. The crowd watched in silence as the alférez asked again, "Will you talk now?" Tarsilo, gasping for breath, managed to whisper, "Take care of my sister." The alférez's face darkened. "Lower him again." It was the final time.